The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came tucked inside a plain white envelope, the kind that looked almost polite sitting on the table next to the oil lamp. No creases, no urgency in its appearance, just a thin rectangle of paper that had traveled from a bank office in Aitkin to a logging settlement on the edge of the Chippewa National Forest, where a woman named May Holloway had spent the last 3 days sitting with grief the way you sit with bad weather, waiting for it to pass, knowing it won't. She did not open it right away. She set it beside the lamp and finished washing the breakfast dishes. She dried her hands on the cloth that hung from the stove handle, the one her husband Clarence had bought at the county fair 2 summers ago. Blue stripes faded almost to white. She folded it back over the handle the way she always did. Then she sat down and opened the envelope. She read it once. Then she read it again more slowly. The Northern Timber and Milling Company held the note on the property. With Clarence Holloway deceased as of September 3, 1908, and no continuation of employment to satisfy the occupancy agreement, full repayment was required. 30 days. The figure printed at the bottom of the page was not large by some measures. By May's measures, it was the distance between standing and falling. She folded the letter and placed it back beneath the lamp. Outside, the birch trees along the creek had already started to turn. Yellow at the tips, first the way they always did in the first week of September in Aitkin County, Minnesota. By October, they would be bare. By November, the creek would slow. By January, if history-held temperatures would sink to 30 below and stay there like a judgment. May Holloway was 63 years old. She had $11 in a tin box under the floorboard near the stove. She had 2 grandchildren sleeping in the back room, Nora, 10 years old, and Cass, 7 children of her younger sister, who had died the previous winter from pneumonia that moved through the settlement like a slow fire. She had a cast-iron stove, a bed frame Clarence had built the year they married, a table, 2 chairs, and a coil of rope hanging on the wall near the door. She did not have 30 days' worth of options. She sat at the table for a long time, not crying, not praying exactly, just sitting the way a person sits when the arithmetic of their life has been laid out plainly in front of them, and none of the numbers add up. The lamp burned low. A log shifted in the stove. From the back room, she heard Cass turn over in his sleep, and the familiar small sound of it, a child shifting, trusting the world to hold, steadied something in her chest. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. She did not sleep. In the morning, she rose before the children and stood at the window with her coffee, watching the tree line go from black to gray to green as the sun came up slow over the eastern pines. This was the hour Clarence had always come back from the early shift at the logging camp, and for a moment the habit of 14 years made her expect his shape at the edge of the tree line, broad shoulders, that particular way he walked with his weight forward, like a man always about to begin something. He had been dead 11 days. A cable snapped during a river drive in early June. The log struck him in the chest. The company paid for the burial. They sent a representative to the settlement who spoke in careful language about condolences and procedures and the nature of occupancy agreements. May had listened to him from across the table with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged into something that the representative probably interpreted as grief-softened compliance. It was not compliance. It was May Holloway cataloging every word the man said, filing it away, the way she filed receipts and weather patterns, and the small structural warnings a house gives before something goes wrong. She had been doing this her whole life, listening past the surface of things to what was actually being said underneath. What was being said was, "We own what you're standing on, and we intend to have it back." She walked the children to breakfast without telling them about the letter. Nora, 10 years old and too observant for her own comfort, looked at May across the table with those careful gray eyes that missed very little. She did not ask. She knew better than to ask before May was ready to speak. That was a thing about Nora. She understood silence the way some children understand music instinctively without being taught. Cass ate his porridge and talked about a bird he had seen near the creek, something with red on its wings, and May listened and asked the right questions and kept her face arranged into the particular expression of attention that grandmothers learn to assemble in the early morning hours when the mind is somewhere else entirely. After breakfast, she sent Nora to gather eggs and Cass to carry water from the creek. Then she sat down with a pencil in the back of the bank envelope and did the mathematics of her situation with the same flat precision she brought to everything. A one-room timber cabin, rough but weather-tight, $40 minimum for materials alone, and that assumed free labor. A used cast iron stove, if the one she had failed, $12. Window glass 5, rope nails hinges another 3. She had 11. Hiring men from town was not a question she even wrote down. There were women in the county who would take in a widow. There were church organizations in Aitkin proper that arranged placements. There were options that involved accepting charity with the kind of gratitude that looks like surrender. May had seen what happened to women who entered those arrangements. Some of them found their footing again. Most of them spent the rest of their lives in rooms that belonged to someone else, grateful, in the particular exhausted way of people who have learned to need very little. She was 63 years old. She had perhaps 15 or 20 winters left if her health held and luck ran even. She was not going to spend them grateful in someone else's room. She folded the envelope and put it in her apron pocket. Then she put on her coat and walked into town. The settlement that called itself Pine Hollow sat 4 miles east along a logging road that turned to mud in spring and froze hard as iron by December. The town itself was modest in the way of all northern timber towns, a main street with a general store, a feed supply, a small post office attached to Raymond Buell's hardware establishment, a boarding house run by a woman named Agnes Marsh, who had opinions about everything and was usually right about half of them. May walked the 4 miles without hurrying. She knew this road the way she knew the back of her own hands, every rut, every place where the pine roots had pushed up through the gravel surface, every stretch where the canopy closed over and the light went green and cool in the summer. She and Clarence had walked it together more times than she could count, in good seasons and bad ones. In the first years when everything felt provisional, like a life still deciding whether to stay, and in the later years when it had settled into something permanent and solid, the way good timber settles after the first hard winter. She reached town by mid-morning. The men on Raymond Buell's porch watched her approach the way men in small towns watch anything that arrives on foot and unannounced, not unkindly, but with the particular attention of people whose lives don't contain much that is unexpected. Inside, Raymond stood behind the counter, sorting invoices. He was a precise man, Raymond Buell, with a precise face and precise opinions about credit and collateral and the proper order of things. He had come to Pine Hollow from somewhere further east, brought with him the habits of a man who had always lived in places where the rules were written down and the exceptions were few. He looked up when May entered. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. His voice was not unkind. It was something worse than unkind. It was carefully neutral, the voice of a man who has already made his decision and is waiting for the formality of the conversation to conclude. She told him what she needed: materials for a one-room shelter, rope, boards, nails, tar, paper. Reasonable quantities. She would pay what she could now and the remainder by spring when she had had time to make arrangements. Raymond listened until she finished. Then he told her he couldn't extend credit to an unattached woman on a property that was already in default. He said it the way you say something you have said before, cleanly, without pleasure, but also without hesitation. May looked at him for a moment. Then she bought 2 pounds of flour and a ball of twine and walked out. She heard the bell above the door close behind her. On the porch, 2 men moved slightly to let her pass. She did not look at them. She was already thinking about something else, something that had been assembling at the edges of her mind for the last 2 days, a shape without a name, yet made of things she had seen and not yet connected. She walked past the feed store, past the post office, past Agnes Marsh's boarding house with its clean curtains and the smell of wood smoke and boiled coffee drifting through the front window. Agnes herself was visible through the glass, moving between tables in the way of a woman who has run her own establishment long enough that the work has become indistinguishable from breathing, automatic, continuous, entirely owned. May kept walking. She walked to the end of the main street and turned south toward the old cedar mill that had shut down 2 years ago when the timber supply on that side of the ridge thinned out. What remained were broken sheds, stacks of warped boards gone silver with weather, and 3 enormous wooden cylinders lying on their sides near the tree line at the end of the abandoned rail spur. She had seen them before. Everyone in the settlement had seen them. They had been part of the landscape for 2 years, the way derelict things become part of a landscape accepted and unexamined. Industrial culverts built to move floodwater beneath rail beds. Cedar staves 3 inches thick bound with iron hoops, each one 10 feet in diameter and nearly 16 feet long. She stopped walking. She stood in the high, dry grass at the edge of the rail spur and looked at them. Then she walked closer. She pressed her palm against the nearest one. The cedar had silvered with weather the way cedar does, not rotted, not weakened, just marked by time. She pressed harder. No give. The iron bands showed rust at the edges, but held their shape seated deep into the wood. She walked around the circumference, slowly measuring with her steps. 31 feet. She did the mathematics in her head. Over 100 square feet of enclosed floor space. Walls already built. Walls 3 inches thick, designed by engineers to resist water pressure, which is to say walls that understood force and had been built to redirect it rather than simply oppose it. She stepped inside. The air was cool and still, shaded. It smelled of cedar sap and old rain, and something she didn't immediately name, something that lived at the back of the smell beneath the surface notes, familiar, in a way she couldn't place until she stood there long enough in the quiet. It smelled like the inside of Clarence's tool chest, the one he kept in the corner of the shed, cedar-lined, that she had opened 1,000 times over 14 years, to hand him something he needed. She stood with that recognition for a moment longer than she had intended. Then she looked up at the ceiling, arching overhead, like the hull of an overturned ship, like the inside of something that had been built to hold against the world pressing in from outside, and she let the shape of what she was looking at settle fully into her understanding. Wind would have no flat face to strike. Snow would slide off the rounded back rather than loading against a wall. The interior volume was smaller than a standard one-room cabin, which meant less air to heat, which meant the stove would work more efficiently for every degree of warmth retained, rather than fighting the geometry of a building that had never been designed with Minnesota in mind. She had not built many things in her life, but she had watched Clarence build them. She had held boards while he nailed them, passed him tools without being asked, learned by proximity, the way you learn a language by living inside it long enough that it stops feeling like translation. She knew what a building needed to survive a northern winter: tight walls, a roof that shed snow, a chimney that drew cleanly. This structure already had two of those three things. She could provide the third. She stood inside the culvert for a long time, turning the idea over the way you turn something heavy in your hands to understand its weight and its balance and where the center of it sits. When she stepped back out into the September afternoon, the grass was bright, and the sky was the particular blue that northern Minnesota produces in early fall, clear and cold-edged, a sky that knows what is coming and has no particular opinion about it. She did not go home immediately. She went back to Raymond Buell's store, but not to buy anything. She went to the small shelf of county documents he kept for reference near the back, the kind of municipal publications that small-town hardware stores accumulate over years: property surveys, land use codes, the occasional legal summary put out by the county recorder's office. Raymond kept them in a neat stack on the bottom shelf because he was a man who believed in having the relevant documents at hand, which was one of the few things about him that May found useful. She found what she was looking for in a document dated 1903, a summary of Minnesota property law regarding abandoned materials on commercial land. She read it twice, standing in the aisle with the light coming through the single high window, reading carefully the way she read everything that mattered, not for the general meaning, but for the precise language, the specific conditions, the exact words that determined what was possible and what was not. Raymond watched her from behind the counter, but said nothing. The language was clear enough. Materials left on commercial property for a period exceeding 24 months without active use or maintenance were subject to claim under the county's abandoned property provisions, provided the claimant filed the appropriate documentation with the recorder's office and no active dispute was registered by the original owner within 14 days of the filing date. She calculated the timeline. The cedar mill had closed in the summer of 1906. It was now September of 1908. 2 years and 3 months. The culverts had sat in the high grass through 2 full winters and 2 full summers without being moved, maintained, or acknowledged in any document she could locate on that shelf or any other. Northern Timber and Milling Company owned the land, but the culverts, by the precise letter of the law May Holloway had just read standing in Raymond Buell's hardware store on a Thursday morning in September of 1908, belonged to whoever filed first. She set the document back on the shelf. She bought nothing further. She thanked no one. She walked out into the September afternoon with her flower and her twine and the particular quiet of a person who has just found solid ground in a place where they expected to find nothing but water. She said nothing to the children that evening. After supper, she sat at the table with the lamp burning in a sheet of paper and did different mathematics this time, not the mathematics of impossibility, but the mathematics of sequence. What needed to happen in what order? What she had, what she could make from what she had. The culvert weighed 2 tons, possibly more. She could not lift it. She did not need to lift it. She needed to roll it 60 yards from the rail spur to the rise behind the shack, where the ground sat higher than the surrounding grade and drained naturally on 3 sides. She would need rollers, timber sections, logs cut to equal lengths. She would need leverage, a pry bar, which she had, and rope, which she had, and a fixed point which the pine stumps along the rail spur would provide. She had done harder things with less. Not in years, not recently, but the knowledge of how to do hard things does not leave a body the way other things leave. It lives in the hands, in the shoulders, in the place behind the sternum, where a person keeps the memory of what they were capable of when circumstances required it. Her hands ached when the weather changed. They had for the last 5 years a low, persistent ache in the knuckles and the joints of her fingers that she had learned to work around the way you learn to work around a bend in a road, and adjusting your pace, choosing your angles differently, not fighting the limitation but accommodating it into the plan. She made a list. She folded it into her apron pocket alongside the bank envelope. Then she put Cass to bed and sat with Nora for a while in the lamplight, the girl reading and May watching the shadows move on the ceiling and listening to the settlement settle into its night sounds, the distant call of something in the pines, the small creek talking to itself in the dark, the wind beginning to find its way down from the north, the way it always did when September began turning toward October. "Are we going to have to leave?" Nora asked without looking up from her book. May looked at her granddaughter, 10 years old and already carrying the posture of someone braced for news. "We're going to find something better," May said. Nora looked up then, studied her grandmother's face with those careful gray eyes, reading it the way she read everything thoroughly without hurry, looking for what was true beneath what was said. Whatever she found there, it satisfied something, because she nodded once and went back to her book without further questions. May blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind, and for the first time in 11 days, she felt something other than grief and calculation move through her chest. Something smaller and harder and more durable than either. Something that did not have a name yet, but felt in the way that useful things feel when you first pick them up and find that the weight is right, like it was going to hold. In the morning, she rose before light. She made coffee. She checked the tin box under the floorboard, $11 4/4, and some loose change that amounted to perhaps another 40 cents. She dressed in the heaviest work clothes she owned. She took the pry bar from the wall near the door and the coil of rope and the borrowed shovel that had been leaning against the outside of the shack since Clarence died. She walked 4 miles back into town. Not to Raymond Buell's store, to the county recorder's office, which opened at 8 o'clock and was staffed by a thin young man who looked genuinely surprised to see anyone before 9, particularly anyone of May's age and particular purposefulness, arriving at his window with a form already identified and a filing fee already counted out in coins. She filed the paperwork for the abandoned property claim on the 3 culverts at the end of the old Cedar Mill rail spur. She paid the filing fee 75 cents from the coins in her apron pocket. The young man stamped the forms with the methodical care of someone who does not fully understand what he is processing, but understands that his job is to process it correctly. He gave her a copy. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket beside the bank envelope. She walked back to the settlement. She walked past the main street without stopping. She walked south to the rail spur through the high, dry grass that caught at her skirt and released it to the cedar culvert. She had chosen the one nearest the tree line, the one whose cedar staves were tightest and most evenly grained, whose iron bands sat most flush against the wood. She set the pry bar against the lowest edge of the culvert. She tested the resistance. 2 tons of cedar and iron sitting on compacted earth undisturbed for 27 months. The first movement would be the hardest. Everything after that would simply be physics. The conversion of effort into distance, 1 foot at a time, 1 day at a time, 1 calculation, followed by the next. She leaned her weight into the bar. Nothing moved. She adjusted her angle, dug the toe of her boot into the earth for purchase, shifted the fulcrum point of the bar 2 inches lower. redistributing the force so that it worked with the geometry of the lever rather than against it. Leaned again, putting not just her weight, but the full available force of her shoulders and her back and 63 years of knowing how to work into the bar. The culvert groaned, a sound like something very old being persuaded to change its mind. A long, low protest of wood and iron against inertia, against the settled comfort of things that have been stationary for 2 years and have no particular interest in becoming otherwise. And then almost imperceptibly a movement, a fraction of an inch, less than that, more than nothing. May Holloway straightened up. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She looked down the length of the rail spur to the rise 60 yards north, where she had decided to anchor the culvert, and she made the calculation not in terms of the 60 yards, but in terms of the next 6 inches. 6 inches was a thing she could see. 60 yards was a thing she would arrive at by accumulating enough 6-inch increments. Behind her at the edge of the rail spur where the grass thinned near the road, a figure had stopped walking. She did not look up. Walter Goss stood at the edge of the spur for a long moment. He was 70 years old, the heaviest man in the county, if you counted experience, and the particular density that comes from 5 decades of building things in northern Minnesota. He had built 3 cabins with his own hands and buried a wife and earned the kind of authority that does not come from telling people things, but from having outlasted most of what life puts in front of you. He stood there the way he always stood when something surprised him with his weight, shifted slightly back, like a man keeping his balance while he decided what he was looking at and what it meant. He said nothing. May did not acknowledge him. She moved the fulcrum point again, reset her grip on the bar, and leaned into the next inch. That afternoon, a man in a company jacket appeared at the edge of the rail spur. Young, with a Northern Timber badge pinned to his lapel, and the manner of someone who has been sent to do something unpleasant and would prefer to complete it quickly and return to wherever he came from. He told her she was handling property belonging to the Northern Timber and Milling Company and that she should stop immediately. May straightened up slowly. She set the pry bar down against the culvert. She reached into her apron pocket with deliberate, unhurried movements, the way a person moves when they have been waiting for a conversation and are not surprised that it has arrived. She unfolded the county recorder's copy of her abandoned property claim and held it out to him without speaking. He took it. He read it. He read it again more slowly with the furrowed attention of someone finding language that does not confirm what he expected to find. He looked at May, he looked at the culvert, he looked back at the document. He folded it carefully along the original creases and handed it back to her. He walked away down the railroad without turning around. May stood and watched him go, at the edge of the property where the grass gave way to the road Denton Briggs had stopped to watch. He was a stout, weathered man of about 50 who farmed the land adjacent to the logging settlement and had a reputation for saying plainly what other people said only to themselves. He had the kind of face that carried his opinions visibly and without apology, and his opinions at this moment were written clearly in the set of his jaw, in the particular stillness of a man who has just watched something he did not expect and has not yet decided what to make of it. May tucked the document back into her apron pocket. She picked up the pry bar. She thought very briefly about the fact that the culverts belonged to Northern Timber, the same company that had employed Clarence on the river drive, the same company whose cable had snapped, whose log had struck him, whose representative had come to offer condolences and retrieve the property in a single visit. There was something almost elegant about it in the cold mathematical way that certain ironies achieve elegance. The company that had taken her husband's life had, without intending to, left her the means of preserving her own. She did not feel satisfaction about this. She felt something quieter and more useful, a particular clarity that comes when the pieces of a situation reveal themselves to be exactly what you needed them to be. Not because the world is generous, but because you looked at them long enough and carefully enough to see what they actually were. She leaned into the bar again, and the culvert shifted another inch north toward the rise where it would spend the winter, and the winter after that, and all the winters that followed. The sun moved west through the pines. May worked until she lost the light. The road back to the shack was dark by the time she walked it, the stars coming out above the pine tops, the air carrying the first real edge of fall cold, the kind that settles in the lungs and reminds you that the season is not pretending anymore. Her shoulders ached. Her hands ached. The welt on her forearm from yesterday's small miscalculation with the rope throbbed in a low, steady way that she had learned to categorize as information rather than complaint. She built up the fire. She fed the children supper. She sat at the table after they were in bed and looked at the list she had made the night before, checking off what had been accomplished and adding what the day had taught her about what came next. 4 feet. In one day, 63 years old, working alone with a pry bar and a length of rope on compacted earth, she had moved 2 tons of cedar and iron 4 feet closer to where it needed to be. She folded the list. She lay down in the dark and listened to the settlement and the pines and the wind finding its particular groove down from the north. And she thought about the shape of a curved wall and what it did to wind that tried to push against it, and how the same principle might apply to other kinds of pressure, other kinds of force that comes at you with the full intention of finding the weakness in what you have built. She thought there is no flat wall here for it to grab. Then she slept. The culvert moved 4 feet on the first day. May knew this because she had driven a stake into the ground at the starting point before she began the way Clarence had taught her to mark progress on long jobs, not to measure how far you had come, but to make the distance honest. Some people found that discouraging. May found it useful. 4 feet was 4 feet. It was not 60 yards, but it was the first 4 feet of 60 yards, and there is a difference between those two things that matters more than the number suggests. 60 yards is an abstraction. 4 feet is a fact. May had always preferred facts. She rose before light on the second day. Her shoulders had stiffened overnight in the way they always did after hard labor, a deep, settled ache that lived in the tendons rather than the muscles, the kind that loosened slowly with movement and never quite disappeared entirely, but became workable once the blood was moving. She dressed without waking the children, drank her coffee standing at the stove, and walked the rail spur in the gray pre-dawn light, with the pry bar over her shoulder and the rope coiled at her hip. She worked until noon, then she walked back to the shack, fed the children, and returned. By the end of the second day, the culvert had traveled 11 feet from the stick she had driven into the ground. She added a second stick at the new position. 11 feet, 49 to go. Nora came on the third day. She appeared at the edge of the rail spur in the late morning, carrying a tin pail with biscuits wrapped in cloth. She set the pail down near May's tools without being asked, and then stood back and watched the way she watched everything with that particular stillness that in a child could be mistaken for shyness, but was not shyness at all. It was attention. Nora gave things her full attention, the way some people give money carefully and without waste, as if attention were a finite resource that should not be spent on things that did not merit it. Cass came too, walking slightly behind his sister with the uncertain posture of a boy who has learned to let someone else judge the mood of a situation before committing to it. He looked at the culvert, then at May, then at the culvert again with the round-eyed assessment of a 7-year-old confronting something that does not fit any existing category. "Are we going to live inside that?" he asked. "Yes," May said. He thought about this for a moment with the solemn deliberateness of a 7-year-old processing genuinely new information, turning it over, checking it against what he knew about how things were supposed to work. Then he said, "Like a tunnel, more like a barrel." He nodded slowly as if this were not only perfectly reasonable, but had actually resolved a question he had been carrying without knowing it. May watched his face complete the adjustment and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. She put him to work carrying flat stones from the creek bed, choosing them for flatness and evenness, the way she showed him rejecting the round ones that would not stack. She put Nora to work clearing brush from the path she had laid out between the spur and the rise, cutting back the tall grass and removing the larger stones that would obstruct the rollers. Children need work the way they need food, not as punishment, but as ballast, something to keep them from floating loose in difficult times, something that connects the body to the present moment and prevents the mind from living entirely in what cannot be changed. Nora understood this without being told. Cass understood it the way children understand most things, by doing it first and comprehending it later, in the quiet hours when the doing has settled into the bones and become knowledge. The three of them worked through the afternoon, 4 more feet by dusk. It was on the 5th day that the rope broke. May had looped the line around a pine stump at the edge of the spur to create a fixed anchor point, threading the rope through an iron band on the culvert and back to the pry bar so that each push of the bar translated into forward movement rather than lateral slip. It was a sound mechanical principle. She had worked it out on paper the night before, checking the geometry twice. The rope was not sound. It was the rope from the wall of the shack, good rope and serviceable rope, but rope that had been hanging in a building for 3 years and had not been tested against 2 tons of rolling cedar moving over uneven ground. It snapped at the midpoint with a sound like a rifle shot. The end whipped back and caught May and across the firm left side just below the elbow. The pain arrived a half second after the sound, sharp and total, the kind that turns the edges of your vision white for a moment and empties the mind of everything except the fact of itself. She stood very still, holding her arm against her chest, breathing through her teeth, with the careful deliberateness of someone managing something that must be managed until the white edges receded and the world came back into normal focus. She looked at her arm. The welt was already rising a red line that she knew from experience would darken to purple by evening and stay that way for the better part of 2 weeks. She looked at the rope. She made a splint of cloth around the weakest section, reinforced it with a strip of leather cut from an old boot she had brought for exactly this kind of contingency, and tested the repair against a pine stump, pulling hard from both directions until she was satisfied it would hold the load she needed it to hold for the distance that remained. Then she went back to work. This was not stubbornness exactly, though people who watch from the road, and there were beginning to be people who watch from the road quietly in the way of communities that have not yet decided what they are witnessing, mistook it for stubbornness. It was something more specific than that. It was the particular determination of a person who has looked at all the alternatives and found each of them unacceptable, and has therefore removed the question of stopping from the available options. When stopping is not available, the only remaining question is how to continue, and that is a significantly more productive question to spend your energy on. By the end of the first week, the culvert had traveled 22 feet. She added a third stick in the ground. 22 feet, 38 to go. On the 8th day, Walter Goss came back. He did not announce himself. He walked to the edge of the rail spur in the late morning, stood at the boundary where the grass thinned, and watched May work with the same expression he had worn the first time, not skepticism exactly, and not approval. Something more neutral than either. The expression of a craftsman who has spent 50 years developing opinions about how things should be done and has encountered something that does not fit neatly into the categories those opinions have established and is still deciding how to proceed. He watched for a long time. Then he walked forward into the spur and crouched beside the culvert's base, running his hand along the leading edge where the cedar met the earth. He examined the contact points where the rollers met the underside of the cylinder. He pressed against the iron band at the lowest point, testing its seat. He stood up and walked around to the anchor rope, examined the splice May had made with the leather reinforcement, tugged it twice with both hands hard the way you test something you have serious questions about. 3 problems, he said. May stopped working. She set the pry bar down and looked at him steadily, not defensively. She had not built enough things to be defensive about the things she had built. She had built enough to understand that problems identified early are problems that can be addressed, and that pride about early work is a luxury of people who cannot afford the consequences of the things that pride causes them to ignore. The front cradle stones are too far apart, Walter said. When this rolls another 8 feet, the ground changes grade and the front will drop. If it drops wrong, the whole thing rolls sideways and nothing stops it until it hits those trees. He pointed to the pine stand 30 feet to the east, thick-trunked and immovable. That happens at any speed. The iron bands fail under the impact, and you have 2 tons of loose cedar staves moving through whatever is in their way. You won't be able to get out of the way. May looked at the front cradle. She looked at the grade change he was describing, tracing the line of it with her eyes, and understood immediately that she had seen it and had not followed the implication forward in time far enough. She had been thinking about the distance already covered. She should have been thinking about the distance still ahead. Second problem, Walter said. That rear iron band is cracked. You can't see it from this side. She came around. He pointed to a hairline fracture on the eastern face of the rear hoop, barely visible in the morning light, a thin dark line running 2 inches along the iron in the direction of the grain stress. If the band failed under load and under the forces she was applying, it would eventually fail if left unaddressed. The rear of the culvert would spread, and the staves would begin to separate from the bottom up gradually, and then all at once. Third problem, he said, the rope splice will hold for another 20 feet, maybe 25, not 60. May looked at the splice. She had known when she made it that it was a repair and not a solution. She had been planning to address it before it became critical. She acknowledged to herself with the flat honesty she tried to bring to her own errors, probably miscalculated how quickly critical would arrive. "How do you fix the band?" she asked. "You don't fix it from the inside," he said. "You reinforce it from the outside. Cut green sapling stock flexible enough to wrap around the circumference of the hoop. Bind it tight over the fracture, and for 6 inches on either side. As the sapling dries, it contracts. Acts as a secondary hoop seated over the compromised one. Not permanent, but sufficient to get you where you're going. And the rope." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the splice again and at the remaining distance to the rise, doing his own calculation. "I have 60 feet of logging line in my barn," he said. "Heavier gauge than anything Buell stocks. I'll bring it tomorrow." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response. No ceremony, no expectation of thanks. He walked the way a man walks when he has done something because it needed doing, and the doing of it is sufficient reason. May watched him go. She looked at the cracked iron band. She looked at the front cradle stones and the grade change she had seen too late. She moved the cradle stones herself that afternoon, repositioning them with the measured deliberateness of someone correcting an error, without dwelling on it, noting it, addressing it, and moving to the next thing, which is the only productive relationship a person can have with their own mistakes. Walter brought the rope the next morning, left it coiled at the edge of the spur, and departed before May arrived. No conversation, no record of the transaction. Just 60 feet of good logging line lying in the grass in the early morning light, which was, May reflected as she picked it up and tested its weight, one of the more useful things anyone had done for her in recent memory. She used it. On the 12th day, she received a second letter. This one came from the bank directly, not the measured language of the first notice, but something sharper, the difference between a door being politely closed and a door being closed with intention. The bank had reviewed the occupancy agreement and determined that due to May's failure to maintain the property in accordance with the terms of the original note, there was a cracked window frame in the front wall, apparently which had been noticed during a recent inspection. The 30-day notice was being superseded. She had 10 days, not from the date of this letter, from the date of the original notice, meaning she had, as of the morning she read these words, 8 days remaining. She sat at the table and read the letter twice. The cracked window frame had been cracked for 2 years. Clarence had meant to replace the glass every spring, and every spring there had been something more urgent, a fence to mend a roof section, to reseal the kind of continuous maintenance that a working logging settlement shack required, and that had always taken priority over the aesthetic consideration of a window frame that was cracked but not failing. The bank knew about it because someone had walked around the property and looked for something, which meant the bank had sent someone specifically to look for a reason to shorten the timeline, which meant there was already an arrangement somewhere between the bank and Northern Timber that required her to be gone on a schedule that had nothing to do with the terms she had agreed to. She understood this clearly and without particular surprise. She had understood from the moment the first letter arrived that she was dealing with people who had more patience than she did if she waited, and less patience than they pretended if she did not. She folded the letter. She put it in her apron pocket with the other one. She woke the children before dawn. They moved what they could move in 8 days, not everything, not close to everything, but the things that mattered most in the order that they mattered. The stove first, which required 2 full days to properly dismantle transport on a sledge, May improvise from old mill boards and reassemble on a flat stone she had already positioned inside the culvert. Clarence's bed frame taken apart piece by piece and reassembled. The table, the tin box, the lamp. Nora's books wrapped carefully in the blue-striped cloth from the stove handle. Cass carried his own small bundle without complaint, the way children carry burdens when they understand, and the way children understand without being told that now is not the time for the particular kind of complaint that requires other people to stop what they are doing. On the evening of the 8th day, May stood in the empty shack for the last time. The walls were bare. The stove alcove was a square of darker wood where 14 years of heat had colored the floor in a way that could not be undone and would not be erased regardless of what the bank or Northern Timber did with the building afterward. The window frame was cracked as it had always been. Light came through the gap in the late afternoon, the way it had always come striking the floor at the same angle it had struck when Clarence was alive, and when her sister was alive, and when Nora and Cass had parents, and when the world had the shape it used to have before it rearranged itself into this new and unfamiliar configuration that no one had asked for, and that had arrived regardless. She stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she picked up the last item, the pry bar leaning against the door frame where she had left it, and she walked out and did not look back. Not because the looking back would have been painful, though it would have been, but because she had already looked forward and what she had seen there required her full attention. They spent the first night in the culvert on the 21st of September, 1908. The floor was bare earth, uneven and cold, the ground releasing a dampness that came up through the blankets when you lay still long enough. The walls curved inward at the base, stealing floor space that a flat-walled building would have provided freely. The door was a gap May had covered with canvas stretched across a salvaged board frame, which kept some of the wind out and none of the cold. The stove sat near the center on the flat stone May had positioned for it, not yet connected to any chimney because the chimney did not yet exist. They could not light the stove. They had blankets. They had each other. They had the walls 3.5 inches of cedar engineered to resist water pressure, which had turned out in practice to mean something different and considerably more useful than its designers had intended when they drew the specifications. Cass cried for perhaps an hour softly, the kind of crying that is not about any one specific thing, but about the accumulated weight of many specific things that have been held in place through the daylight hours and choose the dark to press outward. May held him until the crying ran its course, and he fell asleep in the particular boneless way of children who have cried themselves out, the tension leaving the body all at once. She held him for a while after he was asleep, feeling the small, steady weight of his breathing. Nora sat against the curved wall with her knees drawn up and her face unreadable in the dark, the posture of a 10-year-old who has decided that the most useful thing she can contribute to the present situation is composure, and who is holding that composure with the kind of effort that looks effortless from the outside and costs considerably more than it appears to cost. May sat with her back against the wall after the children were settled and looked at what needed to happen. Floor, door, chimney. She said the words quietly in the dark. The way you say the things that need doing when saying them is the first step toward doing them. Floor first. If they slept on cold ground through winter, the damp would rise through the blankets and the cold would never leave the bones, regardless of how hot the stove burned. Floor first, even rough, even imperfect. An imperfect floor was better than no floor by every measure that mattered in January in Aitkin County. She began before light the next morning. She found planks in the ruins of the old mill sheds, warped split in places, gone silver with weather and exposure, but wood. Usable wood. She carried them on her shoulder in loads of 3, walking the distance between the mill ruins and the culvert, 4 times, 5 times until she had enough. She dug the center line of the floor down 3 inches and filled the channel with creek gravel for drainage, leveling it by eye, and then checking it with a straight board laid across the surface. Then she laid the salvaged planks across the gravel, while fitting them as tightly as their warping allowed, nailing them where she could find purchase, wedging flat stones beneath the edges where the fit was loose and the nail would not hold. It was not a beautiful floor. It was uneven in places, and the boards did not match in thickness or width, and in one section near the wall, she had to fill a gap with a strip of cedar cut from scrap because nothing she had was quite the right size. But it was a floor. It was flat, and it was dry, and it lifted them off the cold ground, and that was the only thing it needed to be. Agnes Marsh appeared the following morning unannounced, in the way of women who have decided to do something and see no reason to proceed the doing of it with extended discussion. She came across the clearing from the direction of the road, carrying a folded wool blanket over one arm, moving with the purposeful economy of a woman who has run her own establishment for 15 years and has strong opinions about what constitutes adequate preparation for winter. She set the blanket on the culvert's threshold and looked at the canvas door cover and the exposed stovepipe hole in the general state of things with an expression that contained several distinct opinions she chose for once not to voice. "Is there anything you need?" she said in the tone of a woman who has already decided to provide something regardless of what the answer turns out to be. May looked at the blanket. It was thick wool, well made, the kind of blanket that had been washed and dried properly many times and had not lost its weight or its loft. It was exactly the kind of thing they needed and did not have. "That's enough," she said. Agnes nodded once with the brief, decisive nod of a woman who has accomplished what she came to accomplish. She turned and walked back the way she had come without looking back, which May had come to understand over the years of living 4 miles from Agnes Marsh's boarding house, was Agnes Marsh's particular way of expressing something she would never say directly, that she had made her assessment, rendered her judgment, and it was not unfavorable. May picked up the blanket and carried it inside. The chimney problem came next, and it was the one that stopped her. Not the cutting he had a saw adequate to the task, and she had identified the highest point of the curved ceiling as the correct location for the stovepipe exit, both because snow would clear fastest from the peak under the influence of convective heat from below, and because the additional height above the stove would improve the draw. She had marked the circle with a piece of charcoal, measured it twice against the diameter of the pipe section she had, and stood in front of it for 2 days without cutting. The problem was structural, and it was the kind of problem that does not announce itself loudly, but sits quietly in the back of the mind, presenting its implications one at a time, each one more serious than the last. She had watched Clarence build enough things to understand that a curved wall carries its load differently than a flat one. The tension distributes around the circumference, each stave bearing its proportional share of the whole, no single point carrying more than the system was designed to give it. Cut a hole in the wrong place and you interrupt that distribution. Not catastrophically, not immediately, but in the way that small interruptions in load-bearing systems reveal themselves over time and under stress gradually and then suddenly and usually at the worst possible moment. She had thought about it for 2 days and had not arrived at a solution she trusted enough to commit the saw to. On the evening of the second day, Nora was sitting beside the coal stove, doing the thing she did when she was working through something, reading her own notebooks, the small ones she had begun keeping since the first day at the rail spur, filling them with observations and measurements and the particular questions that a 10-year-old asks when she has decided to take the world seriously rather than simply inhabit it. May was staring at the charcoal circle on the ceiling. Nora did not look up from her notebook. "Snow always clears fastest from the highest point," she said in the entirely neutral tone of someone reporting an observation they have recorded and are now simply stating for the record without any particular agenda attached to the statement. May looked at her granddaughter. "I wrote it down on day 3, Nora said, still not looking up. "The culvert's high point clears first, before any other section, by almost an hour." May looked back at the charcoal circle. She had marked it at what she had calculated from the inside as the geometric highest point of the arc. But she had calculated from the inside using estimation rather than measurement, and she had not accounted for the slight variance that comes from the fact that the culvert was not sitting in perfect level. It tilted fractionally toward the north side due to the natural slope of the rise, a variance so small that she had not adjusted for it because she had not been thinking about what it meant for the actual apex of the arc in practice rather than in theory. She went outside in the last light. She walked around the culvert, slowly looking at it the way she should have looked at it 3 days earlier. Not as a problem to be solved through calculation, but as a physical object that had been sitting in the same position through 2 winters and 1 fall, and had evidence written on its surface about which parts of it were most exposed to weather and which parts were most protected by their position. The frost cleared fastest from a point approximately 4 inches further toward the south face than she had marked. 4 inches was not a large distance, but in a curved wall carrying distributed load 4 inches was the difference between cutting through a section where the stave ends carried the highest tension and cutting through the slight overlap zone where adjacent stave edges met a section with less structural roll and considerably more tolerance for interruption. She went back inside and moved the charcoal circle 4 inches south without saying anything. Then she picked up the saw. She cut the chimney hole that evening by lamplight. The cedar resisted each stroke required the full weight of her attention, the saw working against wood that had spent 27 months tightening itself under weather and load into a density that was almost reluctant to part. When the circle finally fell free and the dark outside showed through the opening in the curved ceiling, she sat back on her heels and breathed the air that moved through the new gap, cold and piney, and felt something ease in her chest that had been tight for 3 days. She fitted the stovepipe section through the opening and built up the collar with clay packed between flat stones working in layers, each layer allowed to set and tested before the next was applied. She packed pine resin into the remaining gaps the way she had learned to do everything in the last 3 weeks imperfectly at first, then with increasing understanding of what the material wanted to do when it was worked correctly, and what it did when you tried to force it, and the difference between those two outcomes was considerable. That evening, she lit the stove for the first time. They sat in a half circle on the plank floor. Maynor cast and watched the fire establish itself behind the iron door, with the slow, serious attention of people for whom this fire was not a comfort, but a proof. The pipe drew cleanly. Smoke moved upward and out through the collar with a low, purposeful sound like the beginning of something being decided in the room's favor. Warmth began to gather in the curved space, not quickly and not fiercely, but steadily, moving in from the walls and collecting in the arc of the ceiling, the way warmth moves in a space that has been waiting for it and knows how to hold it. Cass put his hand near the stovepipe and pulled it back immediately. Hot, he reported with the gravity of a 7-year-old delivering important intelligence. Yes, May said. He considered the pipe for a moment. Good hot or bad hot? May looked at the stove. She looked at the pipe drawing clean, and the smoke moving out the way it was supposed to move. She looked at her granddaughter sitting against the curved cedar wall with the notebook open on her knees, the lamplight moving across her face in the warm way lamplight moves when it is working with the shape of a room rather than against it. Good hot, she said. The door came next. She had been using the canvas cover since the first night, and it was not adequate when found its edges, regardless of how she weighted the bottom or tucked the sides, and cold followed wind, with the particular persistence of things that have nowhere else they need to be, and unlimited patience for finding the gap they are looking for. She cut a proper door frame from the salvaged mill's planks, built up the sides with doubled boards to create a threshold with enough depth to hold a door, and hung 2 iron hinges she had carried back from Raymond Buell's store for 75 cents. Raymond had not asked what they were for. He had taken her money and counted back the change with his eyes slightly averted, the way a man avoids looking directly at something that requires him to revise an opinion he has not yet fully revised. May had noticed this and filed it as she filed most things without comment. She cut the door panel from the straightest boards. She had fitted it into the frame with the careful patience of someone who cannot afford to do it twice, and sealed the edges with strips of cloth soaked in tallow that she pressed into the gap with the back of a spoon and allowed to set overnight before she tested it. When the door closed, it fit not perfectly, not with the seamless precision of a cabinet maker's work, but with the functional adequacy of a working door built by someone who cares more about what it keeps out than what it looks like from the outside. She stood outside in the October afternoon and looked at what they had made. A cider cylinder 10 feet in diameter sitting on a rise above the surrounding grade. A door cut into the south face squared and hung sealed with tallow cloth against the wind that would come looking for it in December and January. A chimney pipe rising from the highest point of the roof arc, a thin column of smoke moving from it into the October air. Around the base, flat stones and green tamarack stakes driven into the frozen earth at opposing angles against the lower iron bands, locking the cylinder in place with the patient, humble geometry of things that work not by being stronger than the forces applied to them, but by redirecting those forces into the ground. It was not beautiful. It was held. It was theirs. Denton Briggs came 3 days later. He came in the mid-afternoon when the light was flat and the air had taken on the metallic quality that northern Minnesota air develops in October, that particular cold that is not yet winter, but has stopped maintaining the pretense of being anything else. He walked across the clearing from the direction of his farm, with his hands deep in his coat pockets and the expression of a man who has been deciding whether to do something for several days and has finally settled the decision in favor of doing it, though he is not entirely certain this was the correct resolution. He stood outside the culvert and looked at it for a while without speaking. May came out and stood beside it. Denton looked at the door. He looked at the chimney. He looked at the drainage trench May had dug along the uphill side to redirect meltwater away from the base. He looked at the tamarack stakes driven into the earth at their opposing angles against the iron bands, the arrangement that kept the cylinder from rolling in any direction, regardless of the direction of force applied. "You're going to get those children killed," he said. His voice was not cruel. It held no pleasure in the saying of it. It was the voice of a man who believed what he was saying and understood that believing something clearly and saying it plainly is what separates useful people from people who watch quietly and say nothing until it is too late for saying to matter. May had known men like Denton Briggs her whole life, men who called things what they were and expected the world to appreciate the directness, sometimes correctly, and sometimes because they had simply decided they were right long before they finished examining the evidence. May looked at him for a moment. Then she said simply, "Come inside." Denton Briggs did not move. "Come inside," she said again, not as an argument, as an invitation that contained within it everything she wanted to say that could not be said as well in words as it could be said in experience. He ducked slightly at the doorframe and stepped in. He straightened up inside and stood very still, the way people stand when what they are experiencing does not match what they had prepared themselves to experience, and the discrepancy requires a moment to reconcile. He put his hand on the wall. Cedar 3.5 inches thick, curved the seams sealed with clay and resin. No gap that admitted air at any point along the lower 6 feet where he could reach. The stove burning steadily in the center, its heat gathering in the arched ceiling and settling down through the space with the even quality of warmth that has been properly contained. The temperature inside noticeably substantially different from the October air, outside not warm the way a parlor is warm, not warm the way an indulgence is warm, but sheltered in the specific and meaningful way that a structure is sheltered when it has been designed correctly for the forces it will face. He stood there for a full minute. He moved his hands slowly along the wall, feeling for what was not there, the draft, the cold seeping through the inevitable gap that his expectation of this structure had included. His hand found nothing. He stepped back outside. He looked at the culvert from the outside again, and the look was different from the look he had brought with him when he arrived, not the eyes that carry a conclusion already reached and are looking for confirmation, but the eyes of a man who has just touched something with his hands and is obligated to account for what his hands reported. He did not take back what he had said. He did not apologize for it. He put his hands back in his coat pockets and walked back across the clearing the way he had come. But he did not repeat the warning, and May noticed that. That evening she stood outside in the last light and watched the smoke rise from the chimney pipe. The smoke moved straight up for 10 feet before the wind caught it and bent it south, a clean, purposeful column. The visible evidence of something drawing properly, burning efficiently, doing precisely what it was designed to do without requiring anything beyond what had been built into it. Nora and Cass came outside and stood beside her. They stood there for a while, the three of them looking at the thing they had made from a piece of abandoned industrial equipment and a filing fee of 75 cents and $11 that had been spent carefully across 6 weeks of work that no one had watched and no one had helped with, except in the minimal and practical ways that practical people sometimes help when they cannot quite help helping. Cass slipped his hand into May's. "Does this mean we're staying?" he asked. May felt the weight of his hand, small, trusting, entirely present in the way that a child's hand in yours is always entirely present, offering no reservation and no condition. She put her palm flat against the cedar wall beside her. The wood was cool on the surface and warmer beneath the heat from the stove inside, working its way outward through 3.5 inches of northern cedar in the patient, continuous way that warmth works when it has nowhere urgent to go and simply persists. "This means we already stayed," she said. Above them, the smoke rose straight and thin into the October sky, and the first stars appeared above the pine tops to the east, cold and clear, and indifferent in the way of stars. And somewhere north of the settlement, the temperature had already begun its long, deliberate descent toward the floor of the season, toward the test that was coming, the one she had known was coming since the morning she read the letter by the oil lamp, and did the arithmetic and found at the bottom of all the numbers this rise, this cylinder, this particular and improbable answer to a question no one else had thought to ask. The door held. The chimney drew. The walls did not move. November came in quietly. That was the thing about early winter in Aitkin County that people who had not lived through it did not understand. They expected drama, a sudden drop, a visible announcement, the sky changing colors the way it changed before a summer storm. Instead, it arrived the way debt arrives gradually, and then all at once, each day imperceptibly colder than the last, until you realized one morning that the creek had stopped moving and the ground had set hard as iron, and the season had committed itself fully while you were looking elsewhere and thinking about other things. May noticed it first in the walls. Cedar responds to cold the way most living things respond to difficulty. It contracts, pulls inward, tightens around itself as if gathering resources against what is coming. She had expected this to be a problem. Instead, it solved one. The seams she had packed with clay and pine resin in September had been adequate when she finished them. The gaps reduced but not eliminated, the drafts diminished, but still present in the coldest hours before dawn. By the first week of November, they were better than adequate. The cedar staves had drawn together under the cold, pressing the packed seams tight, creating a seal along the curved circumference that no amount of careful handiwork on her part could have produced as precisely as the temperature managed it simply by falling. She ran her fingers along the interior joints on a morning when the thermometer nailed to the pine outside read 12 degrees. The wall was cold to the touch at the surface as it should be, but there was no movement of air through the seams. No draft finding its way in at the floor level where it would settle and chill the ankles and make the stove fight to heat air it could not hold. No whisper of outside cold threading through gaps she had not found. The structure was tightening around them. She stood in the center of the floor and let herself feel it, not pride exactly, because pride seemed premature with January still ahead, and January in Aitkin County was not the kind of thing you assumed you had handled until you had actually handled it. Something more cautious than pride. The quiet acknowledgement that the calculation had not been wrong so far, and that so far was a different thing than far enough, but was meaningfully better than nothing and considerably better than what most people in the settlement had expected when they heard what she was doing. She fed the stove a half log and went about her morning. The wood supply was the constant arithmetic of the season. In the shack they had burned nearly half a cord by the time December arrived each year, the flat walls shedding heat through every inadequately chinked seam, the drafts running along the floor at ankle height, the stove working against the geometry of a building that had been built for economy rather than efficiency. May had known this and had accepted it as the unavoidable cost of ordinary shelter in an extraordinary climate. Inside the culvert, the mathematics were different in ways she had expected and in ways she had not. The interior volume was smaller. She had measured it at just over 100 square feet of floor space compared to the shack's 168. Less air to heat, but more importantly, less air to lose. The curved walls had no corners where cold pooled in dead zones and established itself into permanent currents that ran along the floor regardless of how hot the stove burned. The single chimney drew cleanly without requiring the stove to compensate for poor draw by burning hotter and consuming wood faster. The door, sealed with tallow-soaked cloth on all four edges, gave at most a finger width of air exchange when wind pressed against it from the north. By mid-November, she was burning roughly a third less wood than she had burned in the shack by the same date the previous year. She kept a record of this, adding a column to Nora's notebook, marking each day's consumption against the previous year's comparable date in her own memory, which was reliable on this subject because she had cut and stacked their wood herself every fall and knew the supply precisely at every point in each winter. The numbers accumulated slowly and consistently, the way good evidence accumulates without drama, without requiring interpretation, simply present in the record as fact. Walter Goss came by once that month. He did not knock. He stood outside in the clearing for a moment, looked at the culvert, looked at the smoke from the chimney, steady thin drawing well, and then came to the door and said without preamble, "The rear iron band. Check the sapling wrapping after the first hard freeze. The green wood will contract as it dries, and the binding may loosen at the east side where the fracture runs." May opened the door fully. "I'll check it," she said. He nodded. He turned to leave. "Walter," she said. He stopped. "Thank you for the rope." He stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the clearing, at the downed grass and the frost on the creek stones and the gray sky above the pine tops. Then he said without turning around, "Clarence was a good man. He taught himself to read at 40 years old. Most men would not have done that." "I know," she said. "I helped him." He was quiet for another moment. She thought about what she knew of Walter Goss, that he did not talk about, that he had built 3 cabins in this county, that his wife had died 5 winters ago in a hard January, that the house had not been as tight as it should have been, and that Walter had spent the years since building other people's walls with the particular thoroughness of a man settling a debt he could not otherwise discharge. She had known this without ever having been told it directly, in the way that you know things about people you have lived near for a long time and have paid attention to. She thought about saying something about it. She decided against it. Some things are better honored by being seen and not mentioned. It was the least I could do, he said finally, for both of them. She did not ask what he meant. She knew. He walked back across the clearing without looking back, and May stood in the doorway watching him go until he reached the road and turned north toward his place. And then she went back inside and fed the stove and checked the rear iron band the following morning, finding exactly what he had predicted. The sapling binding loosened 2 fingers width at the eastern side where the contraction of drying wood had reduced the tension on the cord. She drove the stakes deeper and rewrapped the binding with new cord tighter this time, and checked it again at dusk. It held. The condensation came next, arriving the way new problems arrive once you have solved the initial ones, patiently having waited for the right conditions, presenting itself as the next item on a list that does not get shorter, only different. On the coldest mornings when the outside temperature dropped below zero and the stove had been banked low for the night, thin beads of moisture formed along the interior surface of the iron hoops. Not dripping, not pooling on the floor below, but present in the way that small problems are present quietly and persistently, waiting for you to notice them and take them seriously before they become larger problems with their own consequences. The iron was colder than the cedar surrounding it. Where warm interior air touched the cold metal, moisture surrendered itself from the air and clung to the surface. Left unaddressed through the full depth of winter, this would mean ice by February. And ice meant expansion, and expansion in a sealed structure meant pressure against the clay-packed joints that would test what the clay could hold under that particular kind of stress. May thought about it for 2 days, turning the problem over and examining it from different angles. The way she examined all problems, not rushing toward the first solution that presented itself, because the first solution was rarely the most efficient one, but letting the full shape of the problem become clear before committing to an answer. Then she opened the door for 20 minutes each morning after the stove was fed and the interior was warming, but before she woke the children. Not long enough to substantially cool the space she had worked to heat, long enough to allow a controlled exchange, the slightly more humid air of an occupied interior, moving out the cold, dry air of the northern morning, moving in the moisture balance, shifting in the direction that prevented accumulation. She also drilled 2 small holes near the rear curve of the culvert, each one the diameter of her thumb, and covered them with squares of heavy cloth that could be tied shut with cord during storms when she needed to close the system entirely. The condensation decreased. Not to nothing, there would always be some differential between iron and cedar in deep cold, but to manageable to the thin morning beads that appeared and dried through the morning hours as the interior warmed and the air exchange carried the moisture out before it could accumulate into anything that mattered. She added this to Nora's notebook in the column format the girl had established. Problem, method, result. 3 columns, each one concise and factual. The record of what had been tried and what it had produced, kept in the handwriting of a 10-year-old who had understood without being told directly that the notebook was not a diary and not a school exercise, but a document, the kind that might matter to someone later, that might save someone else the 2 days of thinking that May had spent arriving at the answer on her own. Nora was May reflected on more than one cold evening, by the lamplight, a child who was going to be more capable than most people she encountered would initially expect. May had known this since the first week when Nora had arrived at the rail spur with the biscuits without being asked and had begun making herself useful without requiring direction. But it deepened as the weeks passed into something that was not merely efficiency, but genuine intelligence about the way things worked and the way people worked, and the difference between problems that had solutions and problems that required accommodation. December arrived with the particular finality of a door being closed. The temperature dropped steadily through the first week and settled at a sustained cold that did not vary much between day and night. Single digits in the afternoon, below zero before dawn, the creek frozen solid enough by the second week that Nora could stand at its edge and look at the air bubbles trapped beneath the ice, suspended, and still the creek's motion arrested mid-thought. The barrel held. May measured this every morning the way she measured everything, not with pride, but with the precision of someone who is keeping an honest record. The floor was dry, the seams were tight. The stove consumed its measured allowance of wood and returned its measured allowance of warmth. The children slept through the nights without waking cold, which was the measurement that mattered most to her, more than any figure she put in the notebook, because a child waking cold in the night is a specific and particular failure of shelter that admits no excuse and no qualification. The morning of December 6th, May woke before light and lay still. She had developed the habit of waking this way over the 11 weeks since they had moved into the culvert. Not suddenly, not with the anxious start of someone listening for danger, but with the quiet attentiveness of a person who has learned to read a building the way some people read a face. The culvert had its own vocabulary by now, a set of sounds and silences she had cataloged without intending to, simply by living inside it through enough variation of weather to understand what normal sounded like, and therefore what abnormal sounded like when it arrived. The low creak of cedar contracting in the deep cold of pre-dawn, the specific resonance of wind against the curved exterior. Not a rattle, not the shudder of flat boards in their frames, but a kind of sustained hum that varied in pitch with the wind's speed and direction and had become over 11 weeks as readable to her as the face of a clock. This morning the hum had changed. She lay still and listened to it. The pitch was lower than it had been, lower than the northwest draw that had been the prevailing condition since early November, the long, reliable pull of cold air down the Chippewa Basin that she had mapped in her mind as the baseline against which variations should be measured. This morning the wind came from due north, and within the change of direction was something else, something in the quality of the sound that she had no precise word for, but that her body recognized before her mind had finished identifying it, the way you recognize a smell that means something specific to you before you have named what you are smelling. She rose. She dressed. She opened the door. The sky was the color of old iron flat uniform gray. From the ground to the zenith, a sky that had eliminated the distinction between horizon and atmosphere and replaced it with the same undifferentiated gray repeated in every direction. The air felt dense, pressurized in a way she had not felt since the winter of 1893, which the old-timers in the settlement still referenced as a marker, the way old-timers reference the worst thing they have survived as a unit of measurement for everything that comes after. No birds. Not a single bird in the birch stand at the south edge of the clearing. Not a crow on the fence post, not the pair of jays that had been working the pine stand all month. The birch trees were absolutely still, which should have been reassuring in the absence of wind, but was not, because the stillness of trees before a serious storm is not peace. It is suspension. It is the world holding its breath before it commits to something that does not leave room for revision. She went back inside. She woke the children. She put Cass to carrying split wood from the stack at the east side of the culvert to a pile inside near the stove, enough to last through 48 hours without going outside if it came to that, stacked against the interior wall where it would stay dry and available. She put Nora to checking every door, seal pressing fresh tallow cloth into any gap along the frame that showed light or admitted any movement of air. May herself went around the exterior with the mallet and reset every tamarack stake, driving each one 2 inches deeper into the ground than it had been sitting until the stake heads were flush with the earth and the iron bands showed no lateral play when she pressed against them with her full weight. She wrapped the rear iron band binding with an additional layer of cord, doubling the thickness over the repaired fracture section. She checked the chimney collar and found a hairline in the clay at the northern edge of the pipe base, a freeze crack new from the hard cold of the previous night. She packed fresh clay into it and smoothed it flat with the back of a spoon, working quickly because the clay would not set in cold air as well as it set in warmth, and she needed it to set. She worked for 4 hours. By noon, the wind began. Not the gradual increase of a normal weather system that gives you time to revise your preparations as you understand what is coming. A sudden commitment, as if the storm had been patient long enough and had decided the warning period was over, and that what it had come to do should begin. Wind from due north sustained at a speed that bent the pine tops in long arcs and held them there for 5 seconds, 10 seconds before releasing them to spring back and be bent again. The methodical persistence of something that has made a decision about this valley and intends to complete it. Denton Briggs appeared briefly at the edge of the clearing in the early afternoon, moving with his head down and his coat pulled around him in the particular hunched posture of a man who has already been outside longer than was comfortable and needs to get back to his own place and his own preparations. He looked at the culvert as he passed. He looked at May standing outside, checking the doorframe for the second time, pressing the tallow seals with her thumbs to ensure the cold had not contracted them out of the gap. He paused. He looked at the culvert again, Then he continued across the clearing toward his farm, moving with the urgency of a man who has things to secure before dark and not enough light remaining to do it without hurrying. May went inside and closed the door. By mid-afternoon, the storm had become the thing it had been promising to be since the gray morning sky. Wind that drove snow horizontally, not falling, but traveling hard and granular. The kind of snow that finds every gap that falling snow would never reach and insinuates itself into every weakness with the thoroughness of something that has been given a task and intends to complete it. From inside the culvert, May listened to the storm arrive and change register as it intensified. Below 40 miles an hour, the culvert produced its familiar hum, the low, almost musical resonance of air, moving over a curved surface, the sound of the shape doing what it had been designed to do, deflecting rather than blocking, letting the wind slide past the sides and over the arc, rather than meeting it with a flat surface that would collect the full force and transfer it directly into the structure. Above 50 miles an hour, the sound deepened into something more serious. A sustained bass note that she felt as much as heard vibrating in the cedar walls and in the floor planks beneath her feet and in the air of the interior space itself. The iron bands contributed their own register, a metallic undertone, higher in pitch, than the cedar arriving and fading with the gusts like a string held under varying tension. The structure moved once. A single lateral shudder just before dusk when a gust came from the west at an angle she had not anticipated, not from the north where she had placed her heaviest anchoring, but from due west where the rail spur opened the clearing to a longer fetch across the open ground. The culvert shifted perhaps a quarter-inch on its cradle, the tamarack stakes groaning against the iron bands in the low register of stressed wood against stressed metal, and then it settled back. May had her palm flat against the interior wall. She felt the shudder. She felt the settling. She kept her hand on the cedar and waited, reading the vibration the way she had learned to read it over 11 weeks. The steady vibration of sustained wind loading the higher pulse of a gust, arriving the deep settling resonance that meant the structure had processed the force and found its equilibrium again. The curved wall distributed the force around the circumference. No single point collected more than its designed share. The geometry of the thing was doing exactly what geometry does when it has been correctly applied. The stakes held. She fed the stove with careful deliberateness, half a log at a time, enough to maintain the interior temperature without overheating the pipe in conditions where the draw was being affected by the storm's pressure against the chimney outlet. She had placed a flat stone as a partial baffle inside the culvert near the base of the pipe before the storm arrived, positioned to moderate the draw without blocking it to prevent the kind of back pressure surge that could push smoke into the interior if the wind aligned wrong with the chimney mouth for a sustained period. The stove burned clean through the night. Cass slept from 9 o'clock onward with the complete physical confidence of a child whose body has registered that the immediate environment is safe regardless of what the sounds outside suggest. May had not expected this. She had prepared herself for a night of managing fear, of constructing calm from insufficient materials, of being the source of a confidence she was not fully certain she possessed. Instead, she sat beside a sleeping 7-year-old and felt in the uncomplicated fact of his sleep a kind of confirmation that bypassed argument entirely. Nora did not sleep. She sat against the curved wall with her knees up and the notebook open on her knees and wrote in it by lamplight through the long hours of the storm, noting the times and the sounds and the single shudder in the direction of the gust that had caused it in the time the culvert settled in the register of the settling. Near midnight, she wrote something and set the notebook down and went to sleep, sitting up against the curved cedar wall. May read what she had written when she moved to check on the children an hour later, holding the lamp close to the page in the way you hold a lamp when what you are reading matters. Wind sounds different here, like it can't find us. May set the notebook back down on the floor beside her granddaughter's folded hands. She sat through the remainder of the night with her hand moving periodically to the wall, reading the cedar, the vibration that meant sustained load, the change in pitch that meant a new gust arriving, the deep resonance settling that meant the structure had processed the force and returned to equilibrium. She did not sleep. This was the night the calculation was being tested in the most direct possible way, and she was the only person in the building who needed to be awake for it. Outside, the storm delivered everything it had promised and several things it had not. The empty shack, the one the bank had reclaimed, the one that had been occupied by 3 people through 14 winters, that had been sealed and chinked and maintained, and was by every conventional measure a proper northern Minnesota dwelling, lost half its roof before midnight. May heard it from inside the culvert, a different sound from the storm's general violence, a sharp percussive collapse followed by the sustained sound of materials being taken by wind and redistributed across the clearing without any particular interest in where they landed. She heard sometime after midnight the sound of Denton Briggs's grain shed failing to the east, a low structural groan, the sound of corner joints releasing under lateral load they had not been designed to handle, and then a concussive settling that was audible even through the storm's general volume. She had seen that shed. Square-cornered, flat-walled, built from good timber by a competent man, but built without any particular thought about the relationship between the geometry of a structure and the geometry of the forces it would face over the course of 50 or 60 northern winters. She put another half log on the stove. The culvert held through all of it. Morning came slowly, the way morning comes after nights that have required everything you had available. The storm had not ended so much as exhausted itself, the wind dropping in the last hour before dawn, from violence to something merely serious, and then from serious to persistent, and then from persistent to the ordinary northwest draw that had been the background condition of winter in the basin for as long as anyone in the settlement could remember, the wind that was always there, and that everyone had long since stopped noticing because it was simply what the air did in this valley in December. May opened the door at first light. The world outside had been rearranged. 3 pines at the south edge of the clearing had come down, their root plates lifted and turned the dark earth beneath them, exposed and raw-looking against the snow, as if the ground itself had been surprised by what had been asked of it. Branches covered the clearing so thickly in places that the snow beneath them had been sheltered from the wind and lay in odd protected patches, white and undisturbed, amid the surrounding destruction. The fencing along the northern edge of Denton Briggs' property had been removed entirely from its posts, not broken, not bent, simply absent, taken somewhere by the wind, with the thoroughness of a process that does not distinguish between things people value and things they do not. The old shack stood at the far edge of the clearing, with one wall remaining upright, tilted inward, at perhaps 15 degrees, the posture of something that had tried to hold and had not quite managed it. The boards and tar paper and the window frame with its cracked glass, the glass that had provided the pretext for shortening her timeline, lay scattered in a radius around the single remaining wall, mixed with the shingles and the door hardware and the 14 years of accumulated ordinary objects that a life in a working shack accumulates, and that were now simply debris in the snow. The drainage trench along the uphill side of the culvert had filled with snow and debris overnight, but the culvert itself sat exactly as she had anchored it on the rise. The tamarack stakes had not pulled free. The iron bands showed no new cracking. The clay around the chimney collar had held. The door opened cleanly. The frame had not racked the threshold, had not shifted. The tallow cloth seals showed no new gaps. Smoke rose from the chimney pipe in a thin, steady column into the pale morning air. She stood outside in the aftermath and breathed the cold and looked at what the night had done and what it had not done, and she felt something move through her chest that was not triumph and was not relief, but occupied the territory between those two things. The particular stillness of a person who has been carrying a very heavy question for a long time and has just received its answer in the clearest possible terms. Walter Goss arrived mid-morning. He came through the debris field from the direction of the road, moving carefully around the downed pine tops, his breath visible in the cold air, wearing his heaviest coat and the wool cap his wife had made him the winter before she died. He walked with the deliberate pace of a man who has somewhere specific to be and intends to arrive there correctly rather than quickly. He came to the culvert. He put both hands flat against the cedar wall and pressed hard, the full-handed grip of a man applying his own considerable weight to a question that matters to him, not the polite touch of inspection, but the press of someone who needs to know what is actually here. He walked around the circumference slowly, his hands trailing along the cedar, stopping at the rear iron band to examine the binding, stopping at the doorframe to run his fingers along the tallow seals, stopping at the base to look at the tamarack stakes still seated in the frozen earth at their opposing angles undisturbed. He stood at the door. May stepped outside. He looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was not easily named. It had several things in it at once, the way the faces of old men do when they have lived long enough to recognize that what they are looking at represents something larger than the specific thing in front of them, and they are deciding how to honor that recognition correctly. "You did not freeze," he said. "No," she said. "The children, they slept." He nodded once. He looked at the culvert again. He looked at the collapsed shack at the far edge of the clearing, the single wall tilted inward at its defeated angle, the window frame with its cracked glass lying in the snow. He looked back at the smoke rising straight and clean from the chimney pipe. "I told you the wind would find the weakness," he said. "Yes, it didn't." No, he was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of something to say, but the presence of something that requires time to say correctly, that should not be rushed, because rushing it would cost it something it cannot afford to lose. "I have been building in this county for 50 years, he said. "I have built with squared timber and fitted stone, and I have argued against every shortcut and every unconventional approach, because I have seen unconventional approaches fail in February, and I have helped carry the consequences of those failures." He paused. "I was not wrong about the failures I have seen. I was wrong about this one." May looked at him steadily. "You changed the question," he said. "I was answering the question of how to build a wall. You were asking what shape a wall should be." He crouched and picked up one of the fallen pine branches from the ground beside the culvert and held it horizontally. He tilted it at an angle to an imaginary wind. "Flat," he said. "Takes the full force. Nowhere for it to go." He rotated the branch so the tip pointed directly into the imaginary wind. "Round. The force splits, follows the curve, passes." He set the branch down in the snow. "I knew this. I have known this for 50 years. I did not apply it because I had stopped looking at the question. I had only the answer I had already given." He put his hat back on and adjusted it against the cold. "I'll tell them," he said. "When they ask me what happened here, I'll tell them I was wrong and what I learned from it." He walked back through the debris field toward the road without looking back. May stood outside the culvert in the December cold and watched him go, and the smoke from the chimney rose above her into the pale morning sky, and somewhere in the basin a crow called once and was not answered, and the seasons settled into the particular hush that follows a storm that has said everything it came to say and is now simply present in its aftermath, waiting to see what the people it tested will do with what they have learned. Denton Briggs came that afternoon. He came across the clearing from the direction of his farm, moving through snow that came to the middle of his shins, carrying his hat in his hand. May noticed this specifically. It was cold enough that no one carried their hat in their hand on a day like this unless they had made a deliberate decision to do so, a decision that cost something in the cold and was therefore a gesture that meant something. He stopped outside the culvert door. May came outside and stood beside the structure. He looked at the culvert. He looked at the remains of the shack. He looked at the culvert again with the focused attention of a man who has spent a long night revising an opinion and has arrived at a different one and is not entirely comfortable with the distance between the two, but is willing to stand in that discomfort because it is honest. He did not apologize. May had not expected him to apologize. Men like Denton Briggs did not apologize for conclusions, they replaced them, which was a different act and in its own way more demanding than an apology because it required acknowledging not just that you were wrong, but that being wrong had a cost worth paying attention to, and that what came after the error needed to reflect what the error had taught you. "Show me how you did it," he said. 3 words that carried everything they needed to carry. Not an apology and not an admission of debt, simply an acknowledgement made in the most direct way available to a man of that temperament, that he was now in a different position relative to the thing in front of him than he had been in before. May opened the door. They stood inside the culvert for nearly an hour. May moved through the interior methodically, the way she had organized her thinking about the structure from the beginning floor. First, then walls, then chimney, then anchoring each element, explained in terms of what problem it solved and why the solution had taken the form it had taken. She showed him the drainage channel beneath the floor planks and why gravel drainage mattered more than people realized when the spring thaw came and the ground released its water. She showed him the stove placement in the chimney collar and the clay and resin sealing method and the reason the chimney was positioned where it was 4 inches south of where she had originally calculated and what had corrected her calculation. She showed him the tamarack stake system and took the time to explain the angle and the opposition, the way the stakes worked against each other, rather than simply against a single anticipated direction of force, so that lateral movement was resisted from every direction simultaneously, rather than only the direction you had managed to foresee. Denton Briggs listened with his full attention, turning what he was hearing over against what he already knew, checking the logic of each element against his own considerable experience of northern construction and northern winters. He did not interrupt. He did not offer his own opinions in competition with what she was telling him. He listened the way a man listens when he has made the decision that listening is what the situation requires. He asked two questions. Both of them were good questions. Both of them were technical, precise about the load distribution in the cedar arc and the depth of the tamarack stakes in frozen ground versus thawed ground. May answered them directly with the numbers she had worked out and the reasoning behind them. When they stepped back outside, Denton looked at the culvert from the exterior one final time, running through his own assessment of what he had seen in most and what he was looking at outside and how the two corresponded. "There are two more vats on the Hemming property," he said, "east side of the spur, better condition than this one. The iron bands are tighter." "I know," May said. "I've been thinking about the Hemming property." "I know," she said again. Something moved across his face at that, not quite a smile, but the underlying architecture of one, the suggestion of an expression that had decided not to commit fully, but was willing to acknowledge that it existed. He put his hat back on and turned and walked back across the clearing. Spring came in March earlier than expected, as if the season had been making up for the violence of December by being generous in its departure. The melt was gradual, and well-behaved cold nights kept the thaw from running too fast, and by April the ground was releasing its frost in the orderly manner of a system returning to itself, rather than collapsing under sudden warmth. The drainage trench May had dug along the uphill side of the culvert handled the meltwater cleanly, directing it down the slope in the channel she had cut specifically for this purpose, away from the base and away from the stakes and away from the lower seams, where standing water would eventually find its way through the clay, packing if given enough time and enough hydrostatic pressure. The culvert was dry inside when the snow cleared from its base in late March. The floor planks showed no warping from ground moisture. The lower seams showed no new cracking beyond what had been there in November. The iron bands examined in April light showed the rust of use and exposure, but no structural failure at any point along the circumference. May opened both vent holes for the first time since November and let the spring air move through the interior, flushing the winter out. The compressed air of an occupied space through 4 months of cold. The particular smell of a sealed building that has been lived in, releasing into the April morning, and being replaced by air that smelled of pine resin and creek water, and the specific green smell of northern Minnesota in the first week of real warmth. By May, Denton Briggs had rolled one of the Hemming vats to his property and begun the preparation work. He came by twice with questions, which May answered directly and without ceremony. In the same manner, she answered all practical questions, stating what she knew, explaining the reasoning where it was not self-evident, declining to speculate about what she did not know. He sent his eldest son a third time with a question about chimney placement, and May gave the boy a piece of paper with the measurements and the reasoning written out in Nora's column format, the format the girl had developed over the winter, and that had turned out to be the clearest way May had found to communicate a procedure that depended on understanding the why as much as the what. Oswald Fenn began his preparation in June. By the following November, 3-barrel homes stood along the valley edge of Pine Hollow. Not identical to May's, each one had been adapted by the person building it, modified for the specific conditions of their site and the specific resources available to them and their particular understanding of the principles involved. But the principles were the same: curved cedar walls, iron bands intact and reinforced where necessary, doors cut clean, framed tight, sealed against the wind, chimneys placed at the ark's highest point where the geometry of convection and the geometry of snow shedding coincided. Word traveled the way word travels in small northern communities. Not through announcement or advertising, but through the quiet accumulation of observation. Someone telling someone what they had seen. Someone else walking over to see for themselves, the radius of knowledge expanding outward from Pine Hollow, the way a stone's impact expands across still water. A man from 2 valleys over came in October to see for himself, He arrived with the particular skepticism of someone who has been told something that contradicts his existing understanding of how things work, and has come to confirm that the contradiction is a misunderstanding rather than a fact. He walked around May's culvert twice, stepping carefully in the frost-hardened grass, examining the anchoring and the chimney and the door frame and the drainage trench with the systematic attention of a man who knows what he is looking at and is looking for the flaw. He stepped inside. He put his hand on the wall. He stood for a full minute, his eyes moving over the floor and the stove, placement, and the sealed seams, and the way the interior curve gathered the stove's heat in the arc of the ceiling and held it in the upper half of the space where it was most useful before it slowly descended, so that the floor was warm from below and the ceiling was warm from above. And the coldest zone in the interior was at mid-height, which is to say nowhere that mattered. He took his hat off. "Warmer than my cabin," he said. "Yes," May said. "How much did this cost you?" She considered the question with the care it deserved because it was the question that mattered to someone standing where he was standing, thinking about what he was thinking about. $11 at the start, she said. Filing fee, hinges, stovepipe fittings. Flour to keep us fed while I worked. What remained when it was done, I could not tell you with precision. The vat cost nothing. The labor was mine. He stood for another moment with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. Then he put it back on and walked outside and stood for a long old time looking at the exterior of the culvert, the smoke rising from the chimney, the tamarack stakes at the base, the drainage trench along the uphill mud, the door seated in its frame with the tallow cloth seals at each edge. He was memorizing it. May recognized the look. She had worn it herself at the rail spur, standing outside the culvert for the first time, understanding that she was looking at something whose value she had not yet fully calculated, but that she was not going to walk away from until she had. One evening in late April, the spring light going gold through the south-facing window, May had cut into the cedar during the first winter, positioned at the angle she had calculated, would provide the most useful passive solar warmth through the coldest afternoon hours. Nora sat on the plank floor beside the stove with the notebook open on her knees. She was 12 now. The winter and the work and the particular kind of education that comes from surviving something that most people in the county had considered unsurvivable had done something to the quality of her attention, deepened it, confirmed it, given it a foundation to stand on that it had previously been constructing without being certain the ground would hold. She had the posture of someone who has been tested and has not been found wanting, and knows it not with arrogance but with the quiet specific confidence of a person who now has evidence about what they are capable of when it is required. She ran her fingers along the curved interior wall. The cedar had darkened over the winter from the stove smoke and the lamp oil and the accumulated warmth of occupancy, not the silvering of exposure and neglect that she had first seen when May pressed her palm against the culvert at the rail spur, but the deeper, warmer darkening of wood that has been lived in. Wood that has absorbed a life's particular heat and held it in the grain. "It still feels like a ship," she said. May sat in the chair beside the stove, the one good chair she had carried from the shack, the one with the woven seat that Clarence had repaired twice because she liked it, and he liked that she liked it. She looked at her granddaughter, 12 years old, writing in a notebook that had started as a record of distances and temperatures and had become over the course of a winter that had asked more of all three of them than any of them had known how to give something else a record of what had been learned in a winter that had required learning it. She looked at the south-facing window where the April light came in at the angle she had planned for the angle that in winter provided warmth through the coldest afternoon hours, and in spring and fall provided the quality of light that makes an interior feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. She looked at the floor she had built from salvaged planks, imperfect and functional, the gravel drainage channel beneath it doing its quiet work. She looked at the door she had hung on 75-cent hinges sealed with cloth and tallow standing in its frame. She looked at the chimney placed at the ark's highest point because a 10-year-old had noticed where the snow cleared first and had written it down. She looked at all of it, the work that no one had seen being done. The mathematics figured by lamplight on the back of a bank envelope, the rope that had broken and been repaired and had held the cracked iron band wrapped in green sapling cord that had contracted as it dried and held tighter than the original. The days when the culvert moved 4 feet and the days it moved 12. The night the storm came from the north at 100 miles an hour, and the morning after the storm, when the smoke rose straight and the door opened clean, and the world outside had been rearranged by something that had found no purchase on the thing she had built. She looked at her granddaughter's hand trailing slowly along the curved cedar wall. "Then we sailed it right," she said. Outside, the spring wind moved through the pine tops with the easy, unconcerned motion of air that has nothing left to prove in a season that has already proven everything it needed to prove. The smoke from the chimney bent south in the light breeze and dispersed above the tree line thin and pale against the April sky, the simple visible evidence of warmth maintained of a stove, burning a door sealed a wall, holding a calculation that had turned out in the end to be correct. Down the valley road, three more chimneys sent their own thin columns into the same sky. The people of Pine Hollow would call them barrel homes. They would build more of them over the years that followed with the confidence of people who had been shown something true about the relationship between shape and strength, between curves and wind, between what a person can accomplish with $11 and the willingness to ask a different question about what is already there and what it might actually be good for. And when strangers came through the valley in later years and stopped at the sight of the cedar cylinders along the ridge, puzzled by their shape and their weathered solidity, and asked how the idea had begun, someone would always point toward the rise at the north end of the settlement, toward the barrel on the rise where the smoke still rose straight in winter, where a woman named May Holloway had anchored the first one in the autumn of 1908 with tamarack stakes and green sapling, cord, and $11 in the particular kind of stubbornness that is not stubbornness at all, but something else. Something that looks like stubbornness from the outside and feels from the inside like simply refusing to accept the answer that the arithmetic first appears to give when what you are looking for is the answer that is actually there waiting for someone to look at the problem from the right angle and see it. The barrel on the rise, the smoke rising straight, the calculation at last complete.